Definitely excited to be back together again and to have our racial justice discussion. And so the first thing that we're going to top it off with is, what is a refugee? How would you describe a refugee? A refugee is generally speaking, is a displaced person who has crossed national boundaries and who cannot or is unwilling to return home due to well-founded fear of persecution, escaping from a war or natural disaster. They are seeking safety or protection from danger. Such a person may be called an asylum seeker until granted refugee status by the contracting state of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees if they formally make a claim for asylum. The lead international agency or coordinating refugee protection is the United Nations Office of the UNHCR. The United Nations has a second Office of Refugees, also known as the UNRWA, which is solely responsible for supporting the large majority of Palestinian refugees. So, talking about the Rus Russo Ukrainian War, it actually began during World War I. The relationship between the Russian Federation and the Ukraine started during World War I as the former Russian Empire was going through its political reform. In 1920, the bilateral relationship between the two countries was changed as Ukraine was conquered by the Russian Red Army and Polish Army. So if you see, can you see my mouse? Is it moving?
No, but I got you.
Okay, thank you. So look at this map right here. You'll see that even though Ukraine is connected to Russia, in 1991, they gained their independence as a nation. But because of the territory that they were in, it was rarely acknowledged as such. A lot of times people mistakenly call Ukraine the Ukraine because they didn't acknowledge them to be a nation of its own. One, because, and we'll talk about it later, they were not a part of the NATO association or affiliation, but they were connected to USSR. So Russia felt that they could command them to be a part of the USSR in a big brother, little brother bullying type of form because they were not protected and in contract with NATO countries. Nevertheless, they started to escalate in 2014. And up until now, the fact remains that Putin has a deep-seated desire to make Russia great again. That sounds familiar, right? If need be, invading the neighbors and destabilizing the entire region.
So thank you, Natasha. We talk about Ukraine like we kind of know what's going on, and I will admit that before preparing with Natasha, I did not know a lot of this, but what was familiar to me and what you can see in this image beforehand is kind of, I enjoyed this picture because it's sort of a snapshot of the rhetoric we're seeing in a lot of media and a lot of sort of political conversations about why are refugees seeking asylum being welcomed into different spaces, and then African and Arab refugees sort of sitting still and waiting for the world to care a little bit. This is not a new trend, though the Russo Ukrainian War is not new either. We're seeing, given the increase of media conversation, given the increase of some videos that we'll show, which will be a little hard to watch. So we offer a content warning for Arab and Russian folks trying to cross the border out of the Ukraine. What we're seeing is a highlighted or amplified version of white refugees, quote unquote, white refugees being treated differently than Black and brown refugees. So we're seeing, you can't log on to Canva or Spotify or Grubhub or DoorDash without seeing a lot of vital and necessary support for Ukrainians. It's been really quite touching to see the world come together about this ongoing crisis in a lot of ways that are super duper powerful. Again, we're seeing in even doctoral programs in highly specific, like microbiology, are offering free education to Ukrainian students who've been displaced by the war. So we're seeing a lot of positives. But for Astasha and I, and for folks of color around the world, we're noticing a lot of offerings, we're noticing a lot of support that has not been offered to survivors and refugees of other global displacements, of other war zones, whether that is everything that Gaddafi did in Libya, whether it is the ongoing crises in Syria, in Palestine. it's kind of striking to see how differently this is discussed. And so we have a couple of examples. And I want to, again, offer a little bit of a content warning for just how hard it is to watch this.
Oh, is it right? Black girl go, they're pushing her, they're not letting her go, they're not letting her go. Is it right? Is it right? They're not letting the black girl go. 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 Letting the black girl go. They're pushing her, they're not letting her go. They're not letting her go. Is it?
We, as you see, there is a figure of a white woman being able to cross onto the train. We're seeing Ukrainian military actively pushing away Black and African refugees or immigrants or tourists or students who are there. I apologize, Stasha, I don't have the other video up currently, but let me find that right quick. I apologize, y'all, for watching me scroll, but I think it's powerful enough. I'd like to just take a sec to pull it up. Where is my chat at? What we're also seeing is not only Black and brown folks being disproportionately, sorry, Sasha, I'm putting your chat on blast here. We're also seeing, is this the one? Don't be the first one. Yeah, we're not only seeing folks not be allowed to leave, seeing that.
We don't have arms! We don't have arms! We don't have arms! We don't have arms! We are students! We are students! We don't have arms! We are students! We are students!
Whew, okay, I'm gonna hit pause on there for all of us, but I have the rage goosebumps. In case you weren't able to hear it, what that was African and Black students afraid of being shot by Ukrainian military, and you can hear them repeatedly yelling, "We don't have arms, we don't have arms, we are students." As somebody who is an international student myself here, I cannot imagine the level of terror of going somewhere to better your life, quite literally of legal status, which is one of the things that we always hear, right? Like, why are you in that country? And being perceived as a threat. I do have to take a minute. I think Nastasha laughed at me when I said this yesterday, but we have to acknowledge that, let's just call a thing a thing. If you are from the Congo, you do not look like you are Russian, but we are still seeing Ukrainian soldiers actively try to shoot or attempt to deter Black individuals when it is clear that the enemy is Russian. You picking up what I'm putting down here? So we're seeing this active level of hostility, not only from invading Russian forces, but from those who are in charge of keeping Ukrainian folks and those in the Ukraine safe. So it's this really, whoo, that got me emotional. This really terrifying double bind of you're not allowed to leave, you're not getting the support while you're there. And we wanted to sort of amplify these clips as hard as they are to see, because it shows that refugees are not monochromatic.
So I'm still breathing on that one, y'all. Like I'm legit still breathing on that one, because it's disheartening to see that it's a lie. And so we want to ask the question, what is the right kind of refugee, right? Like, what do you consider a right refugee? There is no right refugee. There is no wrong refugee. And so with that, just taking a little focus on an asylum seeker, who is a person who leaves their country of residence, enters another country and applies for asylum, right? An asylum seeker is an immigrant who has been forcibly displaced and might have fled their home country because of war and other factors harming them or their family. And it may not even be just their home. It could be their place of study. It can be their place of work. Wherever they are, that's what they're calling home right now. And so because it's what they're calling home right now, they're seeking safety. That's the number one thing that we want to focus on. No matter if they are a native of that country or not, they're seeking safety. And if you're seeking safety, everybody should be entitled to safety. How do we determine if we're eligible to seek safety, or determine that you're strong enough to endure what is being inflicted on your current home, on your current situation at this time? Who has the judgment to say this person can go because they look like they are Ukraine, or they can't come from here because their eyes are not the right color. Their hair doesn't show the same nation's origin. Honestly, we're all mixed with something. And so at the end of the day, like, it doesn't matter. The number one thing that we should be focusing on is safety. If you're not safe, then let's find a place for you to be safe.
Very, very recently in 2015, NATO and the EU actually came together and declared 2015 the year of Europe's refugee crisis. For those of you who may not be remember, or because US media didn't really amplify it, this was the year in which hundreds and thousands, excuse me, of Syrian refugees were displaced. Their homes were destroyed. Every manner of horrific thing were happening to men, women, children, and trans folks in Syria. You might remember the image of the 3-year-old boy in the red shirt and the little jeans who was dead and washed up on shore. You might remember stories of also African migrants who were found dead on rafts as they tried to cross the Mediterranean. There were repeated instances of Spanish government officials pretty much yelling at Moroccan government officials for allowing the Africans to cross through Morocco to Spain. This was a time in European history in which a lot of communities banded together and closed borders. So there are countless stories of, for example, Hungary closing its borders to Syrian families saying, we don't have the money, like Europe's already strained, go to Poland and see if they'll take you. So what we had was kind of a really heartless game of pinball in which families were seeking refuge with their babies, as you can see here, kept in what we would consider to be sort of detainment camps, trying to find somewhere where they could be safe away from the threat of death and violence. 2015 is a year that you all know came right before 2016. This is when we also saw a lot of the rhetoric that fueled Trump's campaign of, you know, make America great, keep Europe safe. This was also when we started to hear a lot of similar rhetoric around Brexit, when the United Kingdom, or a lot of the United Kingdom, decided to leave the EU because it wanted to keep itself pure and white. So again, to emphasize that neither Stasha or I are saying that Ukrainian folks do not deserve support, because they absolutely do. It's just been very hard for us, I think, as women of color, but then also as just humans, to see the discrepancies in which these different refugee crises are talked about.
So then going to the media's response to the Ukrainian crisis, right? And so let me say that this President Zelensky, he went to bat for his country and doing everything possible to turning down the U.S. offer to evacuate him and his family, and then going in the front line and showing the damage and still standing with his country while it's falling, right? And so we know that social media is a way to allow us to see things in real time. But the question is this helping, or is it hurting Ukraine right now? Is it helping us as not necessarily a nation, but uniting, or is it hurting us? Is it making people of color feel some type of way that, you know, the response that we're getting compared to what we've gotten when it comes down to other refugees, like all of that, we have to take that into consideration. While we're seeing these real-time images, is it helping to shape and understand the suffering that they're showing us, or is it making us honestly feel some type of way? Keep in mind that the response of Syria refugees close to, I want you to keep that in mind, right? Ukrainian war was first attacked, or the first attack was in February of 2022. It is now March the 23rd, right? The 23rd. So from February of 2022 till March the 23rd, there have been close to 3 million Ukrainians that have fled their country and become refugees. They've gotten safety, and I'm glad that they got safe, right? But compared to Syria refugees, this is several times the amount of refugees who arrived in Europe from Syria in 2015. Wow, like several times the amount. And that's something that we really have to think about.
Yeah. I appreciate you highlighting that discrepancy, because remember, 2015 was the year of Europe's refugee crisis. There wasn't enough money for the thousands of Syrian refugees, but as you said, 3 million Ukrainians were thankfully and mercifully helped out. Nastasha's far more gracious than I am. I also wanted to highlight the fact that Zelensky, who again has gone to bat for his people, who is an admirable leader, has also been through the media the subject of a lot of physical objectification, where there was a trend early on, right after the Ukraine was attacked and civilian lives were lost, where people were posting Zelensky thirst traps. And the level of nausea that I feel at that is just something that I want to just put a little bloop in there. It's not the highlight, but it's the way that we frame these things, right? Whew. So talking about how we frame the refugee crisis, we had a few examples from key media sources, everything from BBC to Al Jazeera, and these are all direct quotes from the folks that we turn to in times of diplomatic crisis to provide us with information, the first of which being Ukraine's Deputy Chief Prosecutor, David Saakashvili, who I probably mispronounced his name. I'm sorry, Mr. David. However, David over here said that this was a particularly emotional time for him to see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed. This is a thread that, spoiler alert, you're going to see throughout a lot of media, is that there has been a concerted effort from the part of politicians and media pundits alike to say, wait, this isn't those regular refugees.
Yeah, so it definitely the favoring of the white skin and blue eyes is a reminiscent of the 1940s Clark doll experience. It's so sad to see that history is repeating itself, and even seeing that it's not evolving. In this experiment in the 1940 Clark doll experiment, we found that when asking innocent children which doll was the pretty doll, which doll was the smart doll, they would point to the fair skinned doll. To see that it's not just doing it in America, but we're doing it across the world through innocent children and figures that are looked up to is actually like just very disheartening.
Mm-hmm. To piggyback off of that, it was not only questions of attractiveness, but also trust. And we saw it in communities that are not white. So in terms of mestizo Mexican children, there was still the tendency to view white bodies and white people as more trustworthy, as more valuable. This again continues, we see it sort of as a vicious cycle of racialization and of racism, whether it's kids who see this or whether it's these political pundits we see. So a Bulgarian prime minister, who I need to say, looks like my brother. We're not white, you know, but this gentleman over here said these are not the refugees we are used to, referring to Ukrainian refugees. He goes on to say these people are Europeans. These people are intelligent and they are educated. So the use of the words European, intelligence, and educated as synonymous implies that anything outside of that world, anything outside of Europe, is automatically called into question of not as intelligent, not as educated, even though the second clip we played for you today was students, graduate level students, folks with more degrees than all of us put together, quite literally having their lives threatened on all fronts.
So just going off of the whole intelligence thing, I said I wasn't gonna read it, Hannah, but I feel like I gotta read it.
No.
It's definitely going to be a disclaimer. It was for me. This is, I'm going to read a little clip, and I kind of did some copy and pasting or some cutting just to get you guys the description. This is from 1901. The encyclopedia offered a scientific evidence about intelligence of Black or African American individuals to that of white people. So this is anthropology, the designation of the distinctly dark skin and opposite to the fair, opposed to the fair yellow and brown variations of mankind. In its widest sense, it embraces all the dark races whose home origin is the intertropical and subtropical region of the Eastern Hemisphere. So it's not Europe, anything but Europe or anything away from Europe, right? And so in certain of the characteristics mentioned above, they would appear to stand on a lower evolutionary plane, that of white men. They are mentally inferior to whites. The children were sharp, intelligent, and full of vivacity. One, on approaching the adult period of gradual change set in, the intellect seemed to become clouded. I'm gonna read that one more time. The intellect of Black people, the intellect seemed to become clouded, animation giving place to a sort of lethargic briskiness and yielding to indolence, which means avoidance of activity or exertion or laziness. And this is their scientific citation. Like, this is something that is considered to be scientific as of 1901.
Mhm. You might be thinking, why are we talking about something from 100 years ago? It's because this text was foundational to how current science, sociology, and anthropology view Black versus white intelligence, creativity, value. So this text became seminal in terms of how we view Black intelligence, how we have understandings, or some people have misunderstandings, that Black folks don't experience pain to the same degree that white folks. And so we wanted to amplify that history is fully repeating itself in so many painful ways. Again, we see the same sort of rhetoric that we saw in 1901, where a CBS broadcaster, who has spent, might I just say, decades living in the Middle East, traveling through Africa, traveling through Asia, has spent the majority of his life in non-white settings, described that Ukraine isn't a place like Iraq or Afghanistan that has seen conflict raging for decades. Which, pause, it has seen conflict raging for decades, because we've established factually that the Rus Russo Ukrainian War has been going on for decades, since World War I. So my boy Charlie was wrong. He also goes on to say that Ukraine is relatively civilized and relatively European. So even in that sentence, because we are still more nuanced than Black versus white, but we are aware of the hyper anti-Blackness of this, even to Charlie D'Agata, who has spent his life studying international countries and conflict zones, there's a gradient here where, okay, Ukraine's not as bad as those brown countries, but it's not fully European. It's relatively civilized. It's relatively European. And so it sort of belies a lot of the value that we're ascribing.
So, Lucy. Okay, so first I want to talk about how after she said what she said, she covered her tracks. She did a good job covering her tracks so that it would be hard for us to find what she had to say. 20 minutes later, no worries, we found it. What does third world nation, what is that? Like, can we just talk about that for a second? It started as a term definitely used to describe a country's allegiance. The third world nation is a country whose views are not aligned with NATO. That was previous, right? However, using the third world now is a phrase commonly used to describe a developing nation. But let's just be honest, all nations are still developing. And it's not okay to say, and she knew it wasn't okay to say, and that's the reason why she covered her tracks, and it took 20 plus minutes to find this.
We also see this in predominantly non-white spaces, this rhetoric continuing, though Peter Dobby himself is white. He wrote that he said, Primetime News, what is compelling about the Ukrainian refugee crisis is that these are prosperous middle-class people. So emphasizing this could never happen to us sort of rhetoric, right? The way that we sort of place war on Black and brown countries, on those third world nations. He goes on to say these are not obviously refugees trying to get away from the Middle East, and then he flounders and says, or North Africa. They look like any European family that you'd live next door to. He then goes on to talk about how their cars look like your cars and their children look like your children. And while those very well may be true, there's such a divide in this language.
To put it bluntly, these are not refugees from Syria. These are refugees from Ukraine. They're Christian, they're white. Oh, Kelly. I'm gonna let this one sit for a minute. And I'm gonna be honest with y'all. I told Hannah, I ain't got nothing to say. I don't have anything to say with Kelly. Like, are you serious?
She's an NBC anchor, again, who is acclaimed for her international work. I apologize for my miscitation there on Al Jazeera, but we structured these to sort of show the sort of just how thinly veiled this is. It's not veiled at all. I agree. I got nothing nice to say about dear Kelly over here. However, there are insane double standards in terms of how both the media and different politicians have responded. We have Joy Reid here, she's got the Reid Show. She's a fantastic anchor as well. As you can see, she is a Black woman. She called out very gently and very graciously what we're talking about today. She agrees that what we're seeing in the Ukraine is the absolute worst humanitarian crisis that Europe has seen in decades. That is factual. We haven't seen anything like this since the former Yugoslav Republic. However, she is quick to point out that we haven't seen the same solidarity that we would have seen in 2015 with the Syrian refugees, throughout the early 2000s in Libya, when it came to the Rwandan crisis, the ongoing Ethiopian crises. She very clearly states that we don't need to ask ourselves if the international response would be the same if Russia attacked a country that wasn't white and Christian, as Kelly graciously pointed out. She encouraged audience members to do a lot of soul searching, and I'll give you a little second to read the rest of her remarks here. What is not surprising, although hugely heartbreaking, is that Joy Reid has been dragged through the bushes professionally, politically, personally, morally, you name it, because she is a Black woman who spoke up, who dared to say that Black and Brown lives matter, and she's getting dragged through the mud. Whereas all of these other pundits have received some criticism. Like, of course, we're out here criticizing them. We found these quotes. There is some energy on Twitter and in more informal spaces challenging the Kelly Cabellas of the world, who are being super white centric and kind of white supremacist. But Joy Reid was at risk of losing her job based off of highlighting the inherent racism of whose life we're valuing more. And so we wanted to uplift that she's doing the work. She's out here calling attention to these things. But in her addressing racism, even internationally, as a Black woman, she's put herself as yet another target to the same white supremacy that we're seeing.
So again, we talk about the fact that it's disheartening that Ukraine is going through this, right? It is. And so it's also, I felt important to talk about NATO and who they protect and who they don't protect. So NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It is the world's largest military alliance, and it now has 29 nations. As of now, it has 29 nations. Ukraine has been targeted of Russia's violence since World War I because of where it is. And because right now, well, in that area, it is a part of the land of Russia, but it is separate from Russia. And so with that, just to give you a little background on NATO and the international or the criminal courts, or before I go into that, I want to tell you that the NATO is I'm sorry, I don't know why my tongue gets twisted. It constitutes a system of collective security whereby its independent member states and agrees to mutual defense and response of an attack by an external party. So if Ukraine was a part of the NATO nation and they were trying to work with Ukraine to be a part of the NATO nation, if they were a part of the NATO nation, as soon as that first bullet was struck on Ukraine, then those other nations would have been coming in to fight with them. But because they're not a part of the NATO nation, all of these other countries are standing back against Russia. They are, however, allowing refugees to come for safety. When it comes down to protecting that land, the NATO countries are not protecting that land. They're standing back and standing down, but assisting. Basically, they're saying, I'm here, but I'm not really here. So Biden and other world leaders have referred to Putin as a war criminal. And because of this, the International Criminal Court could try him for his attacks on Ukraine. But there are some obstacles that they're facing right now, and they haven't made that decision on whether they can try him. And so that's definitely something that we also have to think about too. So this is another picture just showing you the NATO nation. The countries that are involved are red, and then going back to showing you where Russia is and where Ukraine is. Ukraine is that little orange dot. And then a little bit further, I don't have the picture, but just a little bit further over, this is where those surrounding countries are NATO countries. So just thinking about even right next to Croatia, I'm sorry, I'm thinking travel. I'm traveling, y'all. Right next to Ukraine, there are other nations that are protected under. And so it just makes it a little bit more difficult. Thank you, Hannah, for